Owen's return from the dead came with a horrifying message that shook the entire town to its core. The community was stunned when he reappeared, his eyes filled with terror and urgency. His warning, delivered in a trembling voice, was impossible to ignore. Yet no one could have anticipated the chilling truth he carried back from the afterlife. What could be so dreadful that it compelled a boy to cross back from the grave? Let's uncover the shocking revelations that sent his family fleeing in the dead of night, a day that changed everything. Before that fateful day, life moved at a steady rhythm for Owen's family. Mornings were a rush, with the youngest darting off to school, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders. Afternoons were filled with adventures in the woods near their home. Jack worked long hours at the local factory, while Liz juggled the chaos of home life with part-time shifts at the bakery. Emily and Grace, both in high school, balanced their teenage dramas with the occasional playful teasing of their younger brother. Weekends were sacred, spent enjoying family dinners, movie nights, and trips to the park. It was a life built on love, routine, and togetherness. But that crisp autumn day was different. The leaves blanketed the ground in fiery reds and oranges as Owen begged his mother for permission to ride his bike to the park. "Stay on the main roads," Liz warned, her voice both firm and loving. Owen nodded earnestly, eager to gain her approval. His bike, a hand-me-down from Emily, bore scratches and a squeaky chain, but to him, it was a treasure, a gateway to freedom. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the streets, Owen pedaled hard to make it home on time. He knew his mum wouldn't be pleased if he was late. On a whim, he took a detour along a quiet road lined with trees. It wasn't far from home, but unfamiliar, a route he'd never taken before. Then, it happened. In an instant, a car appeared, speeding down the narrow lane. Owen heard the engines roar before he saw it, his heart leaping into his throat. The driver's face was a blur of panic as they swerved, desperately trying to avoid him. But the bike's wheels skidded on loose gravel, and he fell, his body crashing against the cold, unyielding ground. Then, nothing. Silence. When Owen's eyes fluttered open, the world was a haze of spinning lights and urgent voices. Paramedics worked with frantic precision. Liz arrived moments later, her face pale, her hands trembling. Jack followed closely, his rugged demeanor crumbling at the sight of his son on the stretcher. Emily and Grace clung to each other, their faces streaked with tears. "We're losing him," one paramedic murmured. Words cut through the air like a knife as the paramedics worked tirelessly, their hands moving with precision. But despite their efforts, Owen's small body grew still. Liz's sobs filled the void, a raw, aching sound that struck deep into the hearts of everyone present. Jack collapsed to his knees, his hands covering his face, his silent grief no less harrowing. Time seemed to freeze. Every second stretched endlessly, each one heavier than the last. Finally, one of the paramedics looked up, his face shadowed with sorrow. "Time of death, 5:32 p.m., he said quietly. The words hit like a thunderclap, final and irreversible. The family was shattered, their lives changed forever in a single cruel instant. But for Owen, this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The air seemed to thicken, as though time itself had stopped. He felt weightless, floating above the scene of his own lifeless body. The sight was surreal. His mother's anguished cries, his father's broken despair, his sister's tear-streaked faces. Yet from this vantage point, their emotions felt distant, muted, like watching a play unfold behind a pane of glass. He reached out instinctively, longing to touch his mother's shoulder to offer her comfort. But his hand passed through her as though he were made of mist. Then, an unseen force began to tug at him, drawing his attention upward. The world below blurred and faded, replaced by a warm, inviting light. It wasn't just light, it was a presence, an overwhelming sense of peace and acceptance. Owen felt his fears melt away as he drifted closer to it. This felt like where he was meant to be. The light wrapped him in a comforting glow, but suddenly, a jarring sensation halted his ascent. It felt as though invisible hands had seized him, anchoring him in place. A voice, low and resonant, whispered his name. "Owen!" it said, echoing in his mind. The warmth of the light flickered, replaced by a cold unease. He turned away from the brightness and noticed faint shadows in the distance. They shifted and swirled, moving as though alive, watching him. "Don't go," the voice warned, its tone urgent. "There is more you must know." A strange gravity pulled him away from the light, drawing him toward the shadows. His heart raced. The light still beckoned with its serene promise, but the voice carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Against his will, he felt himself being drawn closer to the unsettling darkness. The world around him shifted and transformed. He found himself in a place that was both beautiful and haunting. The ground beneath his feet was soft and luminous, like walking on clouds, yet the air was heavy with whispers. At first the whispers were faint, like the rustling of wind through leaves. But they grew louder, their words becoming distinct. "Help us!" they pleaded. "Don't leave us here!" The voices swirled around him, rising from the shadows like a desperate chorus. Owen's heart pounded as he stood in the eerie glow of this strange, ethereal realm, unsure of what awaited him next. Owen's chest tightened as he scanned the strange landscape, searching for the source of the voices. In the distance, he saw figures, vague, flickering shapes, their forms shifting like shadows in candlelight. Some reached out toward him, their faces contorted in desperation. He wanted to turn and run back to the comforting light, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, immovable. The voice from before returned, stronger and more commanding. "You cannot leave," it said. "Not yet." The whispers around him faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The once bright clouds above darkened, their edges tinged with gray. The heavenly beauty of the landscape dimmed, replaced by an unsettling stillness. A deep unease crept over him, as if the very air had changed. As Owen took a hesitant step forward, the terrain beneath his feet shifted. What had once been soft and cloud-like grew solid and cold like polished stone. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, and he caught glimpses of others, lost souls. Their hollow eyes and outstretched hands seemed to plead for something he couldn't understand. He tried to speak, to offer them comfort or ask what this place was, but his voice failed him. His words were swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a towering figure cloaked in shadows standing at the horizon. Its presence was overwhelming, majestic yet terrifying, radiating a power beyond comprehension. As he approached, the figure turned toward him. An icy chill washed over Owen, not fear exactly, but a profound sense of his own insignificance. This being was beyond human, beyond anything he had ever known. The figure's voice boomed, resonating through the air and deep within Owen's soul. "There is something you must see," it commanded, its tone both a warning and an undeniable decree. Before Owen could react, he felt the pull again, stronger this time, like invisible chains dragging him forward. The figure's gaze bore into him, and he realized that whatever lay ahead would change him forever. The pain of what had happened still lingered, but a strange force continued to pull Owen toward what was to come. The air around him grew colder as the towering figure raised a hand. With a simple gesture, the serene yet unsettling landscape began to dissolve. The clouds and light melted into darkness, replaced by vivid, haunting scenes that felt all too real. It was as though he were watching the unraveling of the world from a perspective no one was ever meant to see. The figure's voice echoed through the void, deep and commanding. "Watch closely," it said. "What you see is not yet written in stone, but it is closer than you think." Before Owen could question the meaning of the words, the visions began. A vibrant city appeared before him, bustling with life. People moved through the streets, their laughter and chatter filling the air. But in an instant, the scene shifted. The ground trembled violently as a massive earthquake ripped through the city. Buildings crumbled into rubble, and the cries of terrified people filled the air, blending with the deafening roar of destruction. Fires erupted, casting an orange glow across the darkened sky as thick smoke rose, choking the life from the once thriving city. Owen's stomach churned as he watched, helpless and horrified. He wanted to look away, but the vision held him captive. The scene shifted once more. This time, he saw a vast forest, vibrant and teeming with life. But the peace was fleeting. Machines roared through the trees, tearing them apart and leaving devastation in their wake. Rivers ran black with pollution, and the once clear skies turned a lifeless gray. Animals fled in panic, their cries piercing the air and echoing in Owen's ears. The figure's voice returned, heavy with sorrow. "This is the cost of unchecked greed," it said. "The world suffers because of choices made without thought for tomorrow." Owen's breath quickened as the visions continued. He saw nations rising against one another, their leaders shouting in anger. The ground was stained red with the blood of countless lives lost to war. The skies darkened, not with clouds but with ash and fire from relentless bombings. Families huddled together, their faces etched with despair, their fear palpable. Owen's chest tightened as a terrifying realization dawned on him. These were not just random scenes, they were warnings, glimpses of a future that felt disturbingly possible. The next vision was the most harrowing yet. He saw a crowd of people, their faces twisted in torment. They stood trapped in a gray, lifeless landscape, their voices rising in desperate, anguished cries. "Forgive us!" they screamed, a haunting chorus that sent chills through Owen's soul. But there was no reply, no sign of salvation. The people reached out, clawing at the empty air, but it was too late. Owen's heart ached at the sight. Tears blurred his vision, the weight of their desperation pressing heavily on him. The figure's voice broke through the cacophony, steady and grave. "Do you see now? Humanity walks a fragile path. There is still time to change course, but the window grows smaller with each passing day." Owen turned to the figure, his voice trembling as he asked, "Why are you showing me this? What can I do?" The figure's gaze, or what passed for eyes, seemed to pierce straight into Owen's soul. "Because you must warn them," it said. "This burden is yours now. The choice to carry it will not be easy, but it is one only you can make." The weight of the figure's words settled on Owen like a heavy cloak. He wanted to protest, to argue that he was just a boy, that this responsibility was far too great. But deep down, he knew the truth. The visions he had seen, the cries he had heard, they were not just warnings. They were a call to action, a plea from a world on the brink. "Please," Owen whispered, his voice breaking. "Send me back. I'll do whatever it takes." The figure was silent for a long moment, its gaze unwavering. Finally, it spoke, its tone firm yet compassionate. "Very well," the figure said, its tone both resolute and foreboding. "But know this, the path ahead will be filled with challenges. The burden you carry will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. Be strong, Owen, for the sake of the world. Be strong." With those final words, the darkness surrounding Owen began to dissolve. The haunting visions faded, replaced by a blinding light that enveloped him completely. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The sterile glow of the hospital's fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Owen's eyelids fluttered open. The world around him felt surreal, as though he were caught between a dream and reality. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, each one feeling unfamiliar yet grounding. Voices broke through the haze, his mother's frantic sobs, the murmured astonishment of doctors. He blinked, his eyes focusing on Liz's tear-streaked face hovering above him. "He's awake," someone whispered, their voice trembling with disbelief. A nurse leaned over to check his pulse, her hands shaking slightly. The room was alive with movement, monitors beeping, medical staff bustling, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion. It wasn't just that Owen was alive, it was how he had returned. Minutes earlier, he had been declared dead. His heart had stopped, his body lifeless. Yet now here he was, blinking up at the ceiling, undeniably alive. Liz clutched Owen's hand tightly, her grip firm but trembling. "Owen!" she choked out, her voice breaking. You're back!" Her tears fell freely, splashing onto his blanket. Jack stood frozen at the foot of the bed, his face a mixture of shock and overwhelming relief. Emily and Grace huddled together, their expressions torn between awe and fear. Owen's lips moved, but at first no sound emerged. His throat felt raw, his body weak, yet his mind was anything but silent. The memories of what he had seen remained vivid and relentless. The towering figure, the visions of destruction, the cries of despair. They replayed in his head like an unending loop. He swallowed hard, managing to rasp a single word. "I saw..." The doctors exchanged uneasy glances, their skepticism clear. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, leaned in closer. "Take it easy, son," he said gently. "You've been through a lot. We'll run some tests, but for now, just rest." But rest was the last thing Owen could do. An urgent need surged within him, a burning desire to speak, to share what he had witnessed. Yet the words remained trapped, caught somewhere between his mind and his lips. Owen closed his eyes, willing the haunting images to fade, but they clung to him, vivid and unrelenting. Over the next few days, his recovery became the talk of the hospital. Nurses whispered about the miracle boy who had defied death, while doctors struggled to find an explanation for his sudden revival. Liz refused to leave his side, her maternal instincts sharper than ever. Jack, on the other hand, tried to keep things normal for Emily and Grace, though it was clear to everyone that something had shifted. Owen wasn't the same boy who had ridden his bike on that fateful day. He was quieter now, his once bright demeanor replaced with a solemn intensity. His eyes, once full of youthful mischief, seemed older, as if they carried the weight of things no 12-year-old should ever bear. Even his voice carried a gravity that made people stop and listen, no matter how simple his words. "The rain will stop soon," he murmured one afternoon, his gaze fixed on something distant. Moments later, the storm outside abruptly ceased, the clouds parting to reveal a clear sky. It wasn't the first time Owen had made such a statement, and each one left those around him uneasy. How could he know these things? And yet somehow he did. As days turned into weeks, Owen's behavior became increasingly puzzling. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his wide eyes filled with fear. "They're coming," he would whisper, though he never explained who they were. Liz and Jack chalked it up to trauma, a lingering effect of his near-death experience. But Emily and Grace weren't so sure. They had seen the way Owen's gaze lingered on things no one else could see, and how he sometimes spoke as though answering unheard questions. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Owen finally broke his silence. His fork clattered against his plate as he looked up, his expression grave. "We're running out of time," he said, his voice steady yet charged with urgency. Everyone stopped, staring at him in stunned silence. Jack frowned, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean, buddy?" he asked gently. Owen didn't answer. Instead, he pushed back his chair and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Liz started to follow, but Jack placed a hand on her arm, shaking his head. "Let him be," he said quietly. "He'll talk when he's ready." But Owen wasn't ready, not yet. The weight of what he had seen, of what he knew, was too much to bear. He spent hours alone in his room, staring out the window at the world beyond. It was a world he now saw differently, fragile, teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. The visions he had experienced showed him a future filled with pain and despair, and the crushing sense of responsibility to stop it weighed heavily on him. Late one night, Liz found Owen sitting on the floor of his room, his knees pulled to his chest. Without a word, she sat down beside him. Liz wrapped an arm around Owen's shoulders, her voice soft and soothing. "Talk to me, sweetheart," she said gently. "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." Owen hesitated, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The weight of his words felt almost unbearable, but finally he whispered, "I saw something terrible, and it's coming for all of us." He couldn't ignore the visions, nor the urgency they carried. Owen knew he had to speak up before it was too late, even if no one would listen. The weight of what he had seen pressed down on him, urging him to act, to warn. At first, he confided in his family, cautiously testing the waters. Liz and Jack listened with a mixture of concern and disbelief as he described the destruction, betrayal, and despair that had unfolded in his mind. He spoke of earthquakes swallowing entire cities, floods washing away homes, and people turning on each other in desperation. His voice trembled as he recounted leaders making choices driven by greed, their actions igniting chaos that rippled across the globe. "This isn't just dreams," he insisted one evening as they gathered in the living room. "It's real. It's coming." His sisters exchanged uneasy glances, and Jack rubbed his temples, clearly struggling to make sense of Owen's words. Liz's voice was gentle but cautious. Maybe you're still recovering," she suggested. "The accident, everything that happened, it's a lot for anyone to handle." But Owen shook his head firmly. "It's not from the accident," he said, his tone unwavering. "I saw it. I was shown. And if we don't do something, it will happen." As the days passed, Owen's urgency only grew. He began sharing his visions with friends at school, with neighbors, even with the local pastor. Many dismissed his words outright, chalking them up to trauma or an overactive imagination. Others humored him with polite nods before quickly changing the subject. Yet there were a few who truly listened. Their reactions varied. Some were curious, while others were visibly shaken. One afternoon, he approached Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived down the street. She'd always been kind to him, baking cookies and sharing stories about her younger years. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice low and serious, "I need to tell you something important." He described a storm, not just an ordinary storm, but one so fierce it would tear through their town with unimaginable fury. The storm Owen described was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Trees would be uprooted, power lines severed, and homes destroyed. As he spoke, Mrs. Henderson's face paled, her hands trembling slightly. That sounds awful, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But how can you possibly know that? Because I've seen it, he replied, his tone steady but urgent. And it's going to happen soon. You need to prepare. A week later, a violent storm swept through the town, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Mrs. Henderson wasn't the only one who remembered Owen's warning. Word began to spread about the boy with the unsettling predictions. People started to pay attention. For every person who believed him, however, there were others who scoffed, accusing him of seeking attention or spreading unnecessary fear. The strain of being both praised and ridiculed began to weigh on Owen. The burden he carried felt insurmountable, growing heavier with each passing day. The visions didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. They came not only in his dreams, but during waking moments, vivid and relentless, flashing before his eyes like fragments of an unending nightmare. And always the figure was there, watching, waiting. "You must move faster," the figure's voice echoed during one such waking vision. "Time is slipping away, and the warnings must be heard." Owen clenched his fists, frustration boiling over. "I'm trying," he whispered, his voice trembling, though no one was around to hear him. "But they won't listen." The figure didn't respond. It faded into the shadows as the vision dissolved, leaving Owen standing in his bedroom, his heart racing and body trembling. The whispers of the visions lingered in his mind, haunting him, a constant reminder of the task he had yet to complete. Desperate for guidance, Owen turned to Father Michael, the pastor of the local church. Known for his compassion and open mind, Father Michael was someone Owen hoped would understand. Pouring out his heart, Owen recounted the visions and warnings, hoping the man of faith might believe him. Father Michael listened intently, his expression calm but unreadable. When Owen finished, the pastor leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "What you're describing is extraordinary," Father Michael said thoughtfully. "But you must understand, people fear what they don't understand. Convincing them won't be easy." "It's true." Owen's voice cracked with desperation. "You have to believe me. If they don't listen, it'll be too late." Father Michael nodded slowly. "Sometimes the truth is a heavy burden," he said gently. "But if you believe this is your purpose, you must keep trying, even if it feels like no one is listening." Owen left the church that day with a renewed sense of determination, but it wasn't enough to silence the doubts creeping into his mind. The whispers of disbelief, the skeptical glances, and the outright dismissal from others weighed on him, making him question whether he could truly fulfill the mission he had been given. One night, sitting alone in his room, the weight of it all became too much. Tears streamed down his face as he buried his head in his hands. "They won't listen," he murmured, his voice breaking under the strain. "They don't listen," Owen sobbed, his voice barely above a whisper. "They don't believe me." The room was silent except for the sound of his ragged breaths. For the first time since the accident, he felt utterly alone. The once close-knit town had become a simmering cauldron of tension. His warnings had spread like wildfire, turning neighbors into adversaries and families into battlegrounds. On one side were those who believed him, their fear driving them to prepare for the disasters he described. They stockpiled supplies, reinforced their homes, and whispered prayers for salvation. On the other side were the skeptics, dismissing his visions as the ramblings of a disturbed boy seeking attention. The divide was most visible at the local diner, the town's longtime social hub. Conversations that once overflowed with friendly banter had turned heated. "He's just a kid," barked Mr. Jenkins, slamming his coffee cup onto the counter. "What does he know about the future?" "More than you, apparently," retorted Mrs. Reed, her voice sharp. "The storm he warned us about happened, didn't it?" "Coincidence," Jenkins muttered, but his tone lacked conviction. The storm had been the most violent in living memory, leaving even the staunchest skeptics unsettled. Meanwhile, the local church became its own battleground. Father Michael, who had initially been sympathetic, found himself caught in the crossfire. Parishioners demanded that he denounce Owen, accusing the boy of blasphemy and spreading fear. "He's playing God," one woman shouted during Sunday service. "He's leading us astray." Others defended him, pointing to the eerie accuracy of his warnings. "What if he's been sent to help us?" a man countered. The congregation erupted into a cacophony of voices, their unity fractured by the boy's predictions. Tensions reached a breaking point when one of Owen's visions came to pass in the most chilling way. For weeks, he had warned of fire, an inferno that would devastate part of the town. His descriptions were vivid: the acrid smell of smoke, the suffocating heat, and the panicked cries of those caught in its path. "It's coming," he had told anyone who would listen. "You need to be ready." Few took him seriously. When a fire broke out at the old grain mill on the town's outskirts, it caught everyone off guard. The flames spread quickly, fueled by dry timber and strong winds. By the time the fire department arrived, the blaze had already consumed several nearby homes. Families fled in panic, scrambling to save what little they could. Gripping what little they could carry, their faces streaked with soot and tears, families fled as the fire raged. Those who had dismissed Owen's warnings were now forced to confront the possibility that he might be telling the truth. The destruction of the grain mill sent shockwaves through the community, altering the way people viewed him. Some approached Owen with newfound respect, seeking his insight with hesitant curiosity. Others grew increasingly fearful, wary of what his next prediction might bring. In the aftermath of the fire, the town's divisions deepened. Groups formed on either side of the debate, their disagreements spilling into public spaces. Signs began appearing in windows. "We believe Owen" on one street, "Stop the fear-mongering" on another. Even the children weren't spared from the tension, their friendships strained by the opinions of their parents. For Owen, the fire felt like both vindication and a curse. He hadn't wanted to be right, hadn't wanted his visions to manifest so vividly. The sight of the charred remains of the grain mill haunted him, and the guilt of not being able to prevent the disaster gnawed at his soul. He carried the weight of every loss, every tear shed by the families who had lost their homes. Late one night, as he lay in bed, the visions returned with an overwhelming intensity. The figure appeared again, shrouded in shadow, its presence as imposing as ever. "The tipping point is near," it said, its voice cold and unyielding. "You will face a choice that will determine their fate." Owen's heart raced, his mind reeling from the figure's cryptic words. What choice? What fate? The questions swirled in his head, but the figure offered no answers. It simply stared at him, its gaze heavy with expectation before fading into the darkness. When Owen awoke, the urgency he felt was sharper than ever. He knew he had to act. But how could he guide a town so fractured, so consumed by fear and doubt? The task felt overwhelming. Yet deep down, he understood that giving up was not an option. The visions were a warning, and he was the messenger. Whether they chose to listen or not, he had to keep trying. While some believed in him and others dismissed him, the danger surrounding them all was growing harder to ignore. The weight of a final warning. The world dissolved into an all-encompassing darkness. Owen felt weightless, drifting in the now familiar void, which soon gave way to a vision unlike anything he'd experienced before. The earth trembled beneath his feet, splitting open into jagged, fiery chasms. Rivers overflowed, torrents of blackened water swallowing entire towns in their wake. The sky, once vast and blue, was smothered in a suffocating grey, lightning slashing across it in violent streaks. Cries of humanity echoed from every direction, desperate, heart-wrenching, and unending. People clung to their loved ones as the ground quaked beneath them, their faces masks of terror and despair. Fires raged, devouring forests and cities alike, while the oceans surged, drowning the last vestiges of safety. Owen's chest tightened as he witnessed the destruction unfold, each detail sharper and more vivid than the last. "Why are you showing me this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of chaos. The figure appeared once more, standing tall amidst the destruction. Its presence was commanding and unwavering, as if it alone remained untouched by the chaos consuming everything around it. Amidst the surrounding chaos, the figure remained unchanged. "This is what lies ahead," it spoke, its voice carrying a solemn weight. "The consequence of humanity's choices." Owen turned to face it, his fist clenched, his voice filled with both anger and desperation. "It can't end like this," he pleaded. "There has to be another way. Please tell me there's something I can do." The figure's gaze was intense, unwavering. "That depends on them," it replied. "Humanity holds the power to change its course, but the willingness to do so is rare. The choices they make now will determine their fate." Owen's shoulders slumped, the gravity of the words pressing down on him. The scenes around him shifted once again, showing glimpses of humanity at its worst: greed, anger, and apathy. A leader stood at a podium, shouting words that divided instead of uniting. Factories belched thick plumes of smoke, suffocating the earth. A child wept alone in a dark alley, ignored by the crowd that passed by, oblivious to her pain. "Why me?" Owen's voice cracked. "Why was I chosen to see all this?" The figure stepped closer, its presence commanding. "Your life was never random," it said. "From the moment you were born, your path was set. Your accident, your death, your return. This was all part of the plan. You were chosen to bear this warning because you have the strength to carry it." Tears welled in Owen's eyes as the weight of the revelation settled over him. "I'm just a kid," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "How can I make them listen?" The figure gestured, and the scenes around them changed again. This time, the images were not of destruction, but of hope. A man paused to help an elderly woman across a busy street, his kindness sparking a ripple of goodness in those who witnessed it. Volunteers worked tirelessly to rebuild homes after a storm, their unity defying the devastation. A child shared their meal with a stray dog, a small act of compassion that spread warmth and light. "There is still hope," the figure's voice softened. "Small acts of kindness and faith can tip the balance. Humanity is capable of great good, but they must choose it willingly." Owen nodded slowly, the glimpses of hope filling him with a renewed sense of purpose. The visions weren't just warnings, they were a call to action, a reminder that change was still possible. But the responsibility felt overwhelming, the stakes impossibly high. What if they don't listen? Owen's voice trembled. What if it's not enough? The figure's gaze hardened, its tone turning stern. Then they will face the consequences of their choices. Warn them one last time. The rest is up to them. The words echoed in Owen's mind as the vision began to fade. The chaos and destruction dissolved into darkness, replaced by a blinding light that surrounded him. He felt himself being lifted, his body weightless, the journey ahead uncertain, but filled with the knowledge that his message had to be heard. The weight of the figure's warning hung heavily on Owen's heart as he slowly opened his eyes, finding himself back in his room. The faint glow of dawn was creeping through the window, but his body felt drained and his mind raced with the enormity of what he had just experienced. The figure's words echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of the task ahead. Warn them one last time. The morning was heavy, filled with an eerie stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Owen stood in the town square, a makeshift podium hastily set up beneath the old clock tower. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and thinly veiled fear. He could feel the weight of their stares and doubts pressing down on him like an unbearable weight. But he knew this was his moment, the final opportunity to deliver the warning he had been given. Taking a deep breath, Owen stepped forward. His small frame seemed lost against the podium, but his voice, though trembling at first, began to steady as he spoke. "I know many of you don't believe me," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I know you think I'm just a kid, that what I've said sounds impossible or insane. But I'm not here to argue or convince you. I'm here because I've seen what's coming, and I can't stay silent." He described the visions in vivid detail, leaving nothing out. The earth splitting open, skies darkened by ash, and oceans rising to drown entire cities. He spoke of the cries of despair, the desperate pleas for forgiveness that came too late. His words painted a grim picture, one that sent chills through those who listened. Still, some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, while others rolled their eyes or whispered dismissively to one another. "You have a choice," Owen said, his voice rising with urgency. "We all do. The future isn't set in stone, but the path we're on is leading us to disaster. We can change it, but only if we act now. Small acts of kindness, faith, and unity, they matter more than you know." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some were thoughtful, others mocked. "We're supposed to listen to a kid?" one man scoffed. Owen felt the sting, but pushed forward. "I'm not here to scare you," he said, "but to show you there's still hope if we work together." Suddenly the ground trembled, and dark clouds swirled above. Panic spread, but Owen's voice cut through the chaos. "It's starting, but we can still make a difference. Please, listen." Some knelt in prayer, others fled, but Owen stood firm as the world seemed to shake around him. Then, the tremors stopped. The crowd was stunned. Owen's heart was heavy as he walked home, unsure of what to make of it all. But when strange occurrences escalated, Owen's resolve began to waver. Shadowy figures haunted his dreams, and voices urged him to give up. Yet a faint warmth reminded him to keep going. One day, Owen met a stranger, Samuel, who shared his visions and the belief that small acts of goodness mattered. Together, they spread kindness, and Owen began to regain his purpose. When Owen addressed the crowd again, his message was clear. Even the smallest light can push back the dark. As tremors shook the earth, Samuel stood by his side, grounding him. "We're with you," Samuel said.